Hi, I'm Klara Syrewicz, and this is On Air. Remote, icy frontiers have unexpectedly captured our attention, and that's where we're heading this evening. And later, we'll see how the colonial patterns of the past still apply in the 21st century. Welcome to a new, very cold war. Northern superpowers, the US and Russia, trailed by aspiring polar dominatrix China, are fueling geopolitical tensions in the Arctic. Perhaps that's why we've all become experts in the geology and politics of Greenland, a place most of us never gave a passing thought to a couple of weeks ago. But then came this.
They should give it up because we need it for national security.
Nothing out of the ordinary, just the new US president threatening to unilaterally invade a democratic nation. I'll let this thought sink in. Now, moving past the trauma, let's see what the US would actually gain from this takeover. To paraphrase Borat, who is Greenland? It's the planet's largest island, 2 million square kilometers, mostly covered by ice, under Danish control since the 18th century, but with very far-reaching autonomy. While it's not an ideal spot for hotels or offices, despite Donald Trump's pause, it is rich in oil, natural gas and rare minerals, essential for battery production and the transition to renewable energy. Rising temperatures could make these resources more accessible, even if there's something perverse about the notion that melting glaciers could help us combat climate change. Greenland's ice sheets are losing 270 billion tons of water each year, and the Arctic Sea may be ice-free by 2035. This opens shiny new possibilities: faster trade routes, military installations, new fishing zones, and rivalry. Trump has claimed Greenland's people are MAGA and would benefit tremendously from a US takeover, but he clearly doesn't expect them to have any say in the matter. Taking a remote territory by force or coercion, claiming to bring civilizing benefits while plundering resources and causing environmental damage, that's very much 19th century European colonialism in Africa. At least Melania already has an outfit for the occasion, just add a baby seal fur coat. Practically speaking, Greenland is hardly Danish. With a population nearly 90% Inuit, it has its own prime minister, parliament and judiciary, controlling most policy areas, including natural resources and the right to negotiate their use. The Danes still oversee defense and work with Greenland on foreign policy, although Greenland's Prime Minister, Muti Eje, in response to Trump's comments, suggested full independence might be accelerated to make clear that the local population isn't a commodity.
We don't want to be Danes. We don't want to be Americans. We want to be Greenlanders.
Assuming Donald Trump Jr.'s staged MAGA merge giveaway has swayed anyone, his dad should be careful what he wishes for. An independent Greenland would rank among the largest countries, bigger than Mexico, but with a population of just about 57,000 and shrinking each year. Copenhagen currently covers about half of Greenland's budget, $750 million to $1 billion annually, supporting what essentially is a shrimp-dependent economy. Greenland receives $500 million in welfare payments, and its residents enjoy free medical care, education and access to Danish universities. So becoming Puerto Rico could be a tough sell for people used to Nordic social benefits. Just saying. Before getting too excited, it's worth asking why Greenland doesn't have a booming mining and oil industry, just a crustacean-based economy. Since taking office in 2021, Prime Minister Eje has made several trips to the US to drum up private investment with little success. While retreating glaciers make resources more accessible, more doesn't translate to easy. The most developed mine was shut down because its rare earth deposits were mixed with uranium, and Greenland has banned its extraction. Greenland's fragile ecosystem means unsustainable mining would be a disaster. But non-radioactive deposits are smaller and harder to reach. The Australian company holding the mining license sued the government for $11 billion. But there's still oil, right? Well, despite US Geological Survey estimates suggesting Greenland may hold up to 31 billion barrels of oil, None has been found after nearly 50 years of exploration. Oh, and did I mention the entombed nuclear waste? If the US took over Greenland, one of its first tasks, aside from funding welfare and buying shrimp, would be cleaning up radioactive waste it left behind years ago. Camp Century, an American military base built in 1959 within a network of ice tunnels and powered by a small nuclear reactor, was abandoned in 1967 due to ice shifts, along with thousands of tons of radioactive residue buried under the ice cap forever. But thanks to climate change, forever is very soon. So what you get is literally a James Bond villain lair mixed with the latest season of True Detective, but with a radioactive time bomb inside. Okay, so how about those big strategic geopolitical gains? Greenland is strategically important to the US, but it doesn't need to be part of the country to fulfill that role. The US's military presence has always been welcome in Greenland, and Washington has been freeloading on that status quo for years, as the Camp Century story can attest. In fact, the US left debris from other abandoned military installations on about 25 other sites, with Denmark spending $30 million to clean up the mess. The US still operates the Bidufik space base, its northernmost outpost and a key part of America's missile early warning system. Joint US-Canadian exercises are held there on a regular basis. Neither Greenland nor Denmark have ever opposed them. While China has repeatedly tried to gain a foothold in the Arctic through investments, Denmark blocked these efforts partly to maintain strong ties with the US. Russia has reopened 50 Soviet-era military bases in the region and held several exercises with major maneuvers planned this year. Additionally, it conducts grey zone attacks on telecommunication infrastructure and has increased close encounters of military aircraft. Also, Russia generates much of its GDP from Arctic oil and gas. With sanctions and a potential ban on Russian LNG imports, Asian markets are becoming crucial. Shipping to Asia takes 63 days through the Suez Canal, but just half that time through the Northern Sea route. Meanwhile, China, calling itself a near-Arctic state, has asserted rights in the region for navigation, fishing and overflight. With Moscow's support, it initiated the Polar Silk Road to open Arctic trade, investing heavily in Siberian gas projects and port infrastructure. Last but not least, Russia has a fleet of several dozen icebreakers, giving it a crushing advantage in naval operation. It is also building the world's largest nuclear-powered vessel, with smaller ones in the pipeline. As critics point out, the US has been surprisingly slow to respond to this. In a Fox News interview, Congressman Mike Waltz, Trump's incoming national security advisor, admitted,
"You have Russia trying to become king of the Arctic with 60-plus icebreakers, some of them nuclear-powered. We have 2, and 1 just caught fire."
The US is on thin ice with its Arctic fleet, and this poses the question of how it plans to maintain sanctions and military superiority. Which is why you need allies with icebreakers, nuclear subs and northern military bases. Thanks to Greenland's ties to Denmark, the European Union has an Arctic coastline, giving it a vested interest in regional defence. NATO's presence in those territories has largely been driven by Europe's response to Russia's military build-up along its own Arctic coast. Sweden and Finland, 2 new NATO members, have brought valuable expertise and manpower to the alliance's northern flank. Regional NATO exercises, with names appropriate for Tinder chats like Cold Response and Dynamic Front, are now regular events. As Faroe Islands Foreign Minister Høgni Hoydal put it, Donald Trump's appetite for Greenland has definitely triggered some shit in the Arctic. Yes, that's a direct quote. Preventing Russia and China from exploiting Greenland is in everyone's interest and can only be achieved through cooperation. While MAGA supporters get excited about Greenland's strategic location and mineral resources, they overlook that the US seems to be getting all it wants from this island, minus the radioactive waste, of course. Ultimately, the real danger in Trump's imperialist fixation is the inspiration it could give to rival powers. Oh, but wait, one already went ahead in Ukraine. Well, I guess Taiwan is next then. We'll continue on the subject of imperialism, but of a different kind. Russia's imposition of its language and culture upon other nations. Frequently enshrined by law, it creates an effective tool for the oppression of opposition movements. Let's look at the examples of Belarus and Ukraine.
For centuries, Ukraine has endured persistent attempts to erase its language and identity. Russian imperial and Soviet authorities repeatedly banned Ukrainian publications and education. Even today, creeping Russian colonialism influences religious practices and media, prompting Ukraine to assert its linguistic sovereignty through state policies and cultural initiatives. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation have all pursued policies of Russification, imposing the Russian language on their subjects, from Central Asia to the Baltics, through government, the education system, and the media. After the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Moscow maintained this pressure through economic ties, using the Russian language to influence what it calls the near abroad.
We are joined by Maria Sadowskaja-Komlacz. Hello, great to have you here.
Great to be here, thank you.
We will talk about the subject that is not often discussed, yet has very powerful real-world consequences, and that's Russian cultural imperialism. So, for instance, Belarusian should be the official language of Belarus, and it has an equal formal status to Russian. However, people who use it on a daily basis and people who expect to get services in national institutions in their own language experience various forms of repression. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Sometimes Russian imperialism really flourishes when there is someone local who wants to use it for political goals. That's exactly what happened in 1995 when the Belarusian language was stripped of the status of the only national language and state language of Belarus, and Russian language was returned as a state language in a national referendum. So language, in the understanding of Mr. Lukashenko, is a tool of political influence on the nation. And if people do not speak their national language daily, they will not start asking questions why they're prompted to form a union state with Russia or maybe become one state with Russia. That has been his policy all this time. At the same time, it would be very inappropriate to say that everyone in Belarus who tries to speak Belarusian daily would be repressed. Belarusian is still the language which is officially taught at schools, and you have to pass your exam on Belarusian language and literature. And several subjects are still being taught in Belarusian, depending on the schools. There are still some schools that have Belarusian as the main language of study. But same as in the Soviet Union, it is kind of hinted that when you go to the university, when you go to a big city, when you become a real professional, you should speak Russian. And that's the difference.
But there are some depressing statistics concerning the language, because in 1985, 70% of ethnic Belarusians use their own language, and by 2019 it is only 28.5%. So really...
used daily, you mean?
Used daily, yes.
Right.
I mean, in daily conversation, but that means that the language really is sort of disappearing.
Well, to use language in daily conversations, you need conditions for that. So if everywhere you have everything in Russian, if you have to really, for example, demand that a blank of a document that you want to fill in, a form, for example, for your passport, or the stamp about your marriage, which you still have in passport, has to be in Belarusians, then very naturally in your daily environment, you don't have many places where you would use your language. And that's a different statistic, for example, from the number of people who understand understand Belarusian and say they have no problem to have content in Belarusian language. It's 95 to 97%. And we always need to look at the statistics coming from countries like Belarus with repressive government with this pinch of salt, with this a little bit double vision, because people sometimes would not want to tell even an anonymous sociologist that they continue using Belarusian language, or they would be ashamed. They think like, maybe I only use it sometimes not in a proper way. But when they're asked, do you understand content in Belarusian, 97% says yes. And that's something that means that the language is not dead, but indeed it is being repressed in its own state. And if this continues, unfortunately, I think the percentage of people who also understand thinking Belarusians will be lower.
So we have another example, Ukraine, and the imposition of Russian language and Russian culture has been a feature of its history since the 19th century. But legal restraints on that kind of form of cultural colonialism have been put in place only recently, 2 years, 3 years ago. So why didn't this happen earlier?
Ukrainians have always been a bigger nation, which also provided them with this natural resistance and resilience. And the Ukrainian language was always tolerated a little bit more, even in the popular culture in the Soviet Union and Russia. You could always see, for example, before the war, that there would be Ukrainian language singers on Russian concerts, which would never happen with the Belarusian language.
Oh, really?
So I think, therefore, maybe Ukraine was not feeling threatened enough. Maybe Ukraine was feeling it was stronger culturally, linguistically. But now what is really comparable in Ukraine to Belarus is, of course, the situation of newly occupied territories, the ones that were occupied in 2014, but also later. This is where you can see how Russia enters the territory and changes textbooks, changes the cultural code, changes the language. And this is unfortunately exactly what the Belarusian president, who doesn't have Russian roots, as far as we know, is doing towards Belarusian speakers in his own state for all the 30 years.
It's an excellent example because the Russians are erasing Ukrainian culture from the occupied territories. It's the so-called also deconstruction of Ukrainian culture. So they are changing some facts and some buildings, for example, to match their dogma. Also, they stole the collection of the Kherson Regional Museum, which the New York Times called the largest art theft since World War II. So this Russification is happening along with pillaging. Are there any initiatives to stop that?
Wow.
Can we do anything about this?
Well, what we can do and what we should do is, of course, support creation of content in the national language. Though, of course, we know the small, so-called small nations in Russia that have been a testing ground for the suppressive colonialism policies before it went, let's say, abroad. But I would come to the language as a very important point here. People have the right to learn in their language, to express themselves in their language, but creating something of equality in a national language requires investment, usually of a state. If the state doesn't invest into that, then businesses. If you don't have big businesses, then the biggest question is money, not even a wish. Because without real financial investments, the West will be only supporting the dying body of the Belarusian language, and through that just helping Putin. In case of Ukraine, it's though different, because Ukraine still have a democratic government, very strong centralized policy, which has re-evaluated the value of the language as a part of the national culture, and therefore Ukraine has much better chances, no matter what, to keep and preserve and develop Ukrainian identity through the language.
It's worth also remembering that Putin's own take on what is acceptable culture and its very oppressive take on the traditional culture or patriotism is also choking Russians themselves. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you for watching.